My son, who has a disability, was playing in the yard, and I was finishing up some work in the barn. The weather was beautiful, and the usual sounds of birds chirping and the wind rustling through the trees made it feel like nothing could go wrong. But then I heard it, an unfamiliar sound, the distinct engine of a vehicle I didn't recognize, pulling into the driveway. I peered out the window and saw a black SUV with tinted windows. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong in a peaceful neighborhood. Two men stepped out, both wearing vests with HOA compliance written in bold letters. Something about them felt off. This wasn't your typical HOA visit. These men didn't have the official markings of any legitimate authority, and their tactical vests made them look more like a security force than anything else. I immediately felt a sense of unease, and as I walked outside to see what was going on, I saw my son standing near the fence. He was getting a little too close for comfort to the boundary line, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just enjoying his day. One of the men, a tall, muscular figure, approached my son, his tone immediately demanding, "You there. Step away from the fence. You're in violation of HOA regulations." I couldn't believe my ears. My son, who was clearly disabled and in no condition to understand some random HOA rule, was being singled out. Before I could react, the man shoved my son, pushing him off balance. Then, without warning, he kicked him hard in the leg. My heart stopped. I rushed forward, yelling at them to stop. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. My son, who had fallen, looked up at me, his face pale with shock and pain. I felt a surge of rage course through me as I rushed toward the men. I was angry, terrified for my son, but I also knew I needed to stay calm. My first priority was making sure he was okay. I knelt down beside him, checking for any signs of serious injury. Thankfully, he seemed to be more shaken than hurt, but that didn't ease the fury boiling inside me. How dare they? The man who had kicked my son stood there, smirking, as if he had done nothing wrong. "Get your kid under control," he said, as if he had the right to speak to me that way. The second man, who had been silent until now, took a few steps forward. He had a look in his eyes that I didn't like, something calculating, like he was ready to escalate things even further. I stood up, my hands shaking with anger, but my voice steady. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I demanded. "You have no right to lay a finger on my son. Get off my property, or I'll call the police." The first man didn't even flinch. "We've been instructed to enforce the HOA regulations, and your property is in violation," he said coldly. "We're authorized to take action if necessary." "Authorized?" I scoffed. "You're not even real law enforcement. You have no right to do any of this. If you think I'm going to let you walk all over my family, you've got another thing coming." As I stepped closer, trying to keep my composure, the second man took a step forward, his hand lingering near his holster. That was it. The line had been crossed. I wasn't just standing up for my son anymore. I was standing up for my family and everything we had worked for. Before I could get any further, the second man raised his hand, like he was going to escalate things physically. My heart raced as I prepared for the worst. But then, just as I was about to say something, I heard the front door open. It was Steve, my MMA coach, who had been visiting for a workout that morning. He had stepped out onto the porch and saw what was happening. "Hey," Steve called out, his voice calm but filled with authority. "What's going on here?" The fake HOA cops froze, clearly surprised to see someone else involved. But Steve wasn't just anyone. He was an MMA coach, and his presence alone was enough to stop anyone in their tracks. The two men turned toward him, sizing him up, but I could see they weren't quite sure what to make of him. This was about to get interesting. Steve's presence was enough to shift the dynamic completely. He stood tall and confident, his arms folded across his chest as he assessed the situation with a calm, unwavering gaze. The two fake HOA cops seemed a little thrown off by his sudden appearance. They had been the ones doing the intimidating, but now with Steve standing there, the tables had turned. "Who are you?" the larger of the two men asked, his voice still full of arrogance, though I could tell the edge was beginning to slip. "This is none of your business." "I'm making it my business," Steve replied, his voice steady and cool. He looked at me, then back at the two men. "No one touches a kid, especially not like that. You're going to leave, or we're going to have a problem." The second man stepped forward, his hand twitching near his holster again, but Steve was faster. Before the man could make a move, Steve was on him. With swift precision, he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it into an arm lock, forcing him to his knees. The man yelped in pain, his face contorted in surprise and disbelief. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," Steve said calmly, his grip tightening just enough to remind the man who was in control. "You and your buddy can walk away right now, or I can make things very uncomfortable for you." The first man, now looking visibly shaken, took a step back, realizing that Steve wasn't someone they could easily intimidate. He looked to his partner, who was struggling to free himself from Steve's grip, and then back to Steve. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, the fake HOA cops seemed unsure of themselves. "You don't know who you're messing with," the first man spat, trying to regain his composure. "This is official HOA business, and we have a right." "Yeah, no," Steve interrupted him. "You're not official anything. You're trespassing and harassing a disabled child. So you can either leave quietly, or I can make you leave." The man hesitated for a moment longer, then, seeing that there was no way out, signaled to his partner. Reluctantly, the second man dropped his arms and nodded to his colleague. Together, they turned and walked back toward their SUV, muttering under their breath, but clearly not eager to challenge Steve any further. "Consider this your warning," Steve called after them, making sure his voice carried. "If you ever come back here, you'll have to deal with me." Once they were out of sight, I turned to Steve, still in shock. "Thanks. I don't know what I would have done without you. That could have gone so much worse." Steve gave a small, reassuring smile. "No problem. No one touches my family, and no one messes with the people I care about." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing by standing up for your son. I've got your back always." I felt a rush of gratitude for Steve. His calm but unwavering presence had turned the entire situation around. Not only had he defended my son and stopped the fake HOA cops from escalating the confrontation, but he had shown that there were people out there willing to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. After the fake HOA cops had driven off, I checked on my son, who was still shaken but seemed to be all right physically. His leg hurt where they'd kicked him, but there were no serious injuries, thank God. I knelt down beside him, my heart still pounding with adrenaline. "Are you okay, buddy?" I asked, my voice gentle but filled with concern. He nodded, though I could see the fear in his eyes. "I'm okay, Dad. I was just scared." I pulled him into a hug. "It's over now. No one's going to hurt you, not while I'm around." As we stood there, still processing what had happened, Steve was already on the phone, making calls to the local authorities. I couldn't believe that this had just happened to us. A simple dispute with the HOA had escalated into something far more dangerous, but it wasn't over. I realized that as long as Karen and her followers were involved with the HOA, there would always be more trouble. When Steve finished his call, he looked at me, his expression serious. "I've called the sheriff's office. They'll be here to take a statement and investigate these two. But I want you to know something. You're not done with them yet. You've seen what these guys are willing to do to get their way. It's time to take this fight to the next level." I was about to ask what he meant, but Steve continued, his tone unwavering. "Karen's still behind all of this. She's probably orchestrated this entire thing, and she won't stop until she gets what she wants. We need to make sure that she and anyone else involved in this corruption get what's coming to them. I'm not talking about just standing your ground anymore. I'm talking about putting a stop to it for good." It hit me then. I had been so focused on defending my farm, my property, and my family, I had forgotten to look at the bigger picture. Karen wasn't just targeting me. She was trying to control the entire community. If I didn't act now, she would keep pushing her agenda, and next time it might be someone else's family she targeted. I nodded slowly, determination building within me. "You're right. It's time to finish this once and for all." The day after the incident, I knew that this wasn't just about physical confrontation. It was about ensuring that Karen and her corrupt HOA couldn't continue to operate with impunity. I knew from my conversations with Steve and others that the HOA was not only a source of corruption, but a vehicle for manipulation and control. I couldn't let this go on, especially with my son in the crosshairs. I reached out to my lawyer and explained what had happened. He was just as concerned as I was. He advised me to file a formal complaint and initiate legal action against the HOA and the fake cops they had sent. This wasn't just about what had happened to my son. It was about putting a stop to the larger pattern of illegal activity that Karen and her followers had been involved in. We began by gathering all the evidence we had, photos of the men in tactical vests, their fake badges, the witness statements from Steve, and the damage they had done. We also included my son's medical report, showing the physical injury he had sustained from the kick. My lawyer advised that we file for assault charges against the fake HOA cops and, at the same time, begin legal proceedings to investigate the HOA's operations. As the days passed, the pressure was mounting. We weren't just fighting for justice for my son. We were fighting to expose the system that had allowed Karen to operate with so much power and control. I wasn't the only one who had been affected. There were other residents in the community who had faced the same intimidation and bullying, but they had been too afraid to speak up. I made it my mission to bring those voices forward. I started reaching out to other neighbors who had been targeted by the HOA's aggressive tactics. Some were willing to come forward, others were still too scared, but together we began compiling a case that would blow the lid off Karen's corrupt regime. As the legal action began, I also made sure to keep the pressure on in the media. Steve and I contacted a local reporter who had covered the HOA's corruption before. The story quickly gained traction, and soon people from other neighborhoods who had experienced similar problems with their HOA started reaching out. What had happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond my farm. Karen and the HOA had underestimated how far I was willing to go. Now we were exposing the rot at the heart of the system. I wasn't just fighting for my son anymore. I was fighting for the entire community. As word spread about the legal action I had initiated against the HOA and the fake cops, the neighborhood began to rally behind me. It wasn't just about one person standing up against injustice anymore. It was a collective effort. Neighbors who had previously been intimidated or silenced started to speak out, sharing their own experiences of harassment, intimidation, and unfair fines from the HOA. What started as a legal battle in my home had quickly become a community-wide movement. People who had been victims of Karen's tactics began to come forward with their stories. One neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, told me how Karen had once fined her $500 for a minor cosmetic issue with her front yard, even though the city's regulations had no such requirement. Another resident, Tom, revealed that the HOA had threatened to seize his property if he didn't comply with some ridiculous landscaping mandate that he never agreed to. The more we shared, the clearer it became. Karen's HOA was a corrupt machine that used fear, intimidation, and manipulation to control the residents and line its pockets. I realized that this was no longer just about the assault on my son. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt system and bringing Karen and her accomplices to justice. We organized a community meeting, open to anyone who had been affected by the HOA's actions. The turnout was massive. People who had lived in fear for years suddenly felt emboldened to speak up. We all shared our stories, and by the end of the meeting, it was clear that we weren't just fighting for ourselves, we were fighting for the future of the neighborhood. Together, we put together a list of demands for the city council and local authorities. We wanted an independent investigation into the HOA's practices, a full audit of their financial records, and the removal of Karen and her board members. We also petitioned to have the HOA disbanded completely, as it had long since outlived its original purpose and had become nothing more than a tool for control and corruption. The media coverage of the story continued to grow, and soon local news outlets were picking up the story. Our movement gained momentum, and the pressure on the HOA and Karen was palpable. The legal battles, the stories from the residents, and the growing public outcry were impossible to ignore. Karen and her board members couldn't hide from the truth anymore. It was no longer just a fight for my farm or my family. It was a fight for justice. We had become a united front, and the more I saw my neighbors coming together, the more I realized that the real victory wasn't just in winning the legal case. It was in the strength and solidarity we were building as a community. As the pressure mounted, things began to move swiftly. With the community backing me and the media coverage growing, the authorities had no choice but to act. The investigation into Karen and the HOA's practices was officially launched. We had presented undeniable evidence of fraud, harassment, and illegal activities carried out by the HOA, and now it was time for the legal system to catch up with the corruption. The sheriff's department began investigating the HOA's financial dealings, and soon, they discovered that Karen had been funneling HOA fees into her personal accounts and using HOA funds to pay off developers for shady land deals. There were hidden contracts, forged signatures, and backroom deals that had allowed her to manipulate the system for her own gain. She had used the HOA as her personal playground, with no regard for the damage she was causing to the community. The legal case grew stronger, and it became clear that Karen and her board were in serious trouble. Local and state authorities were now involved, and as we gathered more evidence, The charges against Karen expanded beyond fraud and financial misconduct. There were also criminal charges related to the assault on my son and the illegal actions taken by the fake HOA cops. I remember the day we finally got the call that the authorities had issued arrest warrants for Karen and several members of her board. It felt like a wave of relief had washed over me. For years, Karen had terrorized us, and now she was going to face the consequences. The victory didn't just belong to me or my family. It belonged to every resident who had been wronged by the HOA's tactics. As the news broke, the community rejoiced. The old fear that had gripped us for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of hope and justice. People who had once been afraid to speak up now proudly stood together, knowing they had played a part in holding Karen accountable. But even as we celebrated this hard-won victory, I knew that this was only the beginning of healing for the neighborhood. The damage that had been done by Karen's reign couldn't be undone overnight, but it was a start. The once toxic atmosphere that had existed under the HOA's rule was slowly being replaced with a sense of freedom and possibility. With the authorities closing in on Karen and her board, it was only a matter of time before the full weight of the legal system brought them down. The court proceedings were intense. Karen attempted to defend herself, claiming that she had acted in the best interest of the community, but her lies were unraveling faster than she could keep up. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the public sentiment had completely shifted. No one believed her anymore. The trial was a spectacle. The media continued to cover the story, broadcasting every twist and turn as Karen's fraudulent actions were exposed for all to see. It wasn't just about the fake HOA cops or the illegal fines she had imposed. It was about the lives she had destroyed, the families she had driven out, and the way she had used her position to enrich herself at the expense of others. But what struck me the hardest was the testimony from the neighbors. One by one, residents came forward to share their stories of how Karen had manipulated them, how they had been bullied into paying unjust fines, how their lives had been turned upside down by her abuse of power. It was a moment of catharsis for many of us, knowing that Karen's actions were no longer hidden behind the walls of her office. Then came the bombshell. It was revealed that Karen had been planning to sell the land she had acquired through her HOA manipulation to outside developers. Her goal was to turn the neighborhood into a luxury development that would price out the current residents and make her millions. The court learned that her entire agenda had been fueled by greed, and her facade as a community leader was shattered. As the judge called for a recess to deliberate, I knew this was the moment of reckoning. Karen and her accomplices had been caught, and there was no escaping the consequences now. The verdict came down swiftly. Karen Whitaker, along with the majority of the HOA board members, was convicted of fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and various other crimes related to their illegal activities. Karen received a lengthy prison sentence, and several others were fined and banned from ever holding office again. The immediate relief was palpable. Karen, the woman who had held so much power over our lives, was no longer a threat. The false authority she had built through fear and intimidation had crumbled. The neighborhood began to breathe again. But even as the legal proceedings were over, the work of rebuilding the community was just beginning. The damage caused by the HOA's reign of terror was deep. Families had been torn apart by fines, evictions, and threats. Some had already left, while others were too scared to speak up. As the community began to heal, I took it upon myself to ensure that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. I worked with the local council to establish a new set of guidelines, a true community-based organization that would give the residents a voice and empower us to make decisions together without the threat of abuse. We also formed a legal defense fund to protect homeowners from any future HOA overreach, ensuring that the corrupt tactics we had faced would never happen again. The fight wasn't just about the victory. It was about setting a new standard for fairness and community empowerment. With Karen and the corrupt HOA board members out of the picture, the next step was to restore trust in the neighborhood. For years, people had been living in fear, afraid to speak up or get involved because they knew they could be targeted by the HOA. Now that fear was gone, but the damage to the community was still evident. It would take time, but we were determined to rebuild the neighborhood and ensure that it became a place where everyone felt safe, supported, and valued. I organized a series of town hall meetings to get input from the residents on how they wanted to move forward. We talked about everything from the physical improvements to the community spaces to the creation of new rules that would be fair and transparent for everyone. The goal was to make sure that no one person or group could ever dominate the neighborhood again. The first major change we made was the establishment of a new residents' council made up of volunteers from different sections of the community. This council would be responsible for making decisions that affected the neighborhood, and its members would rotate on a regular basis to ensure fairness. We also worked on drafting a new set of guidelines that emphasized respect, cooperation, and transparency, rather than the heavy-handed control that had characterized the HOA before. As we worked on rebuilding the community's infrastructure, I began to notice something incredible. The people were coming together in ways they never had before. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now worked side by side to clean up the park, plant new trees, and help each other with home repairs. People who had been too afraid to voice their concerns started speaking up, knowing that they now had a real voice in how things were run. The change was more than just physical. It was a shift in the community's spirit. People began to trust each other again, and that made all the difference.